"I can't live without a man," cried the Apache girl. The rancher's shocking decision will leave you speechless. Wild West drama. Witness this unbelievable, true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky plains of Arizona, where the horizon seemed endless and the earth carried the scars of countless struggles between survival and despair. It was in this harsh land, under the shadow of red mesas and the whispers of the wind, that John Miller lived alone on his ranch. He was a man hardened by years of solitude, a widower who had seen too much loss to believe in miracles. His only company was the creak of the windmill, the neighing of horses, and the haunting silence of the nights when coyotes cried in the distance. On one such evening, as he rode back from town with supplies strapped across his saddle, he spotted something unusual near the canyon's edge. A figure, fragile against the vast desert backdrop, stood unmoving as though carved from stone. As John drew closer, he realized it was a young Apache girl, no more than 18 or 19, her long black hair tangled by the wind, her dress torn and dirt-stained. Her eyes held a strange mix of fear and defiance, but her body looked exhausted, as though she had been walking for days. John dismounted, cautious yet curious. He knew the dangers of interfering. The townsfolk hated the Apache with a burning prejudice. Anyone who harbored one risked not just their land but their life. Still, something about the girl's stillness compelled him to speak. "You lost?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The girl lifted her gaze slowly, lips trembling as though holding back words that had long been silenced. Finally, in broken English, she whispered, "I can't live without a man. I can't survive alone." The words struck him harder than he expected. They were not simply the plea of a frightened girl. They carried the weight of abandonment, of a life ripped apart by violence. John soon learned she was the last of her family after a raid scattered her people. She had hidden, wandering the desert for days without food, with nothing but the instinct to survive. John felt his chest tighten. He had vowed never to get entangled again after his wife died years earlier, taken by fever that swept through the town like wildfire. Since then, he had built walls around his heart as high as the fences around his ranch. And yet here she was, this girl who spoke words of desperation, asking for a chance at life under his roof. The rancher considered turning away. It would have been easier, safer, and expected. But when her eyes met his, he saw not weakness, but determination burning faintly through her weariness. Against all logic, he made his decision. "If you stay," he said firmly, "you'll work hard. This land gives nothing for free. You'll earn your keep." The girl nodded quickly, as if she had been waiting for the smallest shred of mercy. And with that, John helped her onto his horse, leading her back toward the ranch. What neither of them knew was that this choice would ripple across the small town, stirring unrest, curiosity, and danger that neither was fully prepared to face. Life on the ranch was grueling, but the Apache girl, whom John later learned was named Ayoka, though he called her Anna for ease, threw herself into the work. She fetched water from the well, tended the horses, and patched worn clothes with nimble fingers. John had expected her to complain, to falter under the weight of responsibility, but she never did. Her silence was steady, her movements precise, as though proving every day that she belonged. At first, John kept his distance. He was cautious not to grow attached, reminding himself that she was a stranger and her presence was a risk. But over time, he noticed the small changes her presence brought. The ranch, once filled with emptiness, now carried the sounds of another pair of footsteps, the soft hum of a tune she sometimes sang in her native tongue, and even the faint warmth of a meal waiting for him after long hours in the fields. Still, whispers traveled quickly in the Wild West. The small town nearby was a place where nothing remained secret for long. By the time John rode in again for supplies, the murmurs had already begun. Men in the saloon eyed him with suspicion, and one even spat at his boots. "Heard you got an Apache living with you, Miller," the barkeep muttered under his breath. "You know what that'll bring?" John ignored the words, but unease gnawed at him. He knew the town's hatred ran deep, born of battles, raids, and bloodshed that had left scars on both sides. Protecting Anna would not be simple, but when he returned home and saw her working tirelessly, her hands blistered yet unwavering, he told himself it was worth the risk. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and crimson, Anna sat by the corral, her face illuminated by the dying light. John approached quietly and asked, "Why did you say those words?" "I can't live without a man." She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting both sorrow and resolve. "Because alone I am nothing. In desert, wolves, men, hunger. All come for me. With man maybe I live. Alone I die." Her honesty struck John in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't weakness, she had confessed. It was survival. In her world, survival often meant reliance, but not submission. She had chosen to fight in the only way she knew, by seeking protection and in return offering loyalty and labor. As weeks passed, Anna grew stronger. She learned to handle the horses with surprising skill, to mend fences with steady hands, and even to use a rifle when coyotes threatened the herd. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found by the canyon. She was becoming a force in her own right. John watched this transformation with a quiet pride he would never admit aloud. But trouble was brewing. A group of men from town, emboldened by drink and prejudice, decided to confront John. One moonlit night, the sound of hooves thundered across the ranch. Lanterns lit up the darkness as 4 men dismounted at the gate. "Miller!" one shouted. "You got no business harboring an Apache. Send her out, or we'll drag her out ourselves." John stepped out, his rifle in hand, his face cold as stone. "This is my land," he declared. "She works here, she lives here. If any man's got a problem, he can face me first." The men exchanged uneasy glances. John's reputation as a sharpshooter was no secret. None dared test him that night. With grumbles and curses, they mounted their horses and rode back into the dark. But John knew this was far from over. Anna had watched the entire confrontation from the shadows, her heart pounding. When John turned back to her, she whispered, "Why risk for me? I am nothing to you." For a moment, John said nothing. Then finally he replied, "You're not nothing. You're alive. And out here, that's worth fighting for." From that night forward, something unspoken passed between them. Anna no longer saw herself as a helpless girl, and John no longer saw himself as a man destined for loneliness. Together, they had carved out a fragile space in a world that wanted to tear them apart. And though John never voiced it aloud, he began to realize that her desperate words, "I can't live without a man," were not a burden, but a turning point. For in saving her, she had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to keep living. The story of John Miller and the Apache girl had only begun, but already it was one that the desert wind would carry, whispered among the townsfolk, feared by his enemies, and remembered by all who believed that in the Wild West, survival often birthed the most unlikely bonds. The days after the midnight confrontation passed with a strange quiet, but John Miller knew silence in the West was never a promise of peace. It was the calm before the storm, the kind that crept up on you when men nursed grudges and towns whispered until their anger took form. He kept a closer eye on the horizon, his rifle within reach, even when mending fences or tending to the cattle. Anna noticed the change too, though she never spoke of it. She simply worked harder, her movements sharper, as though she could prove her worth through sweat and grit. Her presence on the ranch began to change more than just John's routine. The house, once filled with the hollow echoes of loneliness, carried life again. Anna's laughter, rare but real, sometimes drifted through the wooden walls when she managed to catch a mischievous foal, or when she burned bread in the oven and laughed at herself. She was no longer the girl he had found clinging to survival by the canyon. She was becoming a woman who carried herself with resilience. And though John tried not to admit it, the ranch felt less like a prison and more like a home. Yet outside their land, the talk grew louder. In the saloon, men cursed John's name between swigs of whiskey. They called him a traitor, a fool, even a danger. Some claimed that keeping an Apache was as bad as harboring an outlaw, that it threatened the fragile balance between settlers and tribes. Others argued he had been bewitched by her, that no man in his right mind would risk his standing for a girl of the enemy. The more they drank, the bolder their words became. And in a town where hate simmered just beneath the surface, bold words often turned into reckless actions. One afternoon, while John was working in the field, Anna brought him water in a tin cup. Her face was streaked with sweat, but her eyes carried a calm steadiness that always surprised him. She handed him the cup and asked, "You fear men will come again?" John took a long drink before answering. "I know they will. A man's hatred doesn't vanish just because you stare it down once." Anna sat on the fence, swinging her legs like a child for a moment before her voice grew quiet. "Then I must learn to fight beside you, not hide." He studied her, seeing not the broken girl who had begged for help, but someone who had found a new kind of strength. "You've already been fighting every day since you stepped on this ranch," he said. But later, he took her out back, handed her a rifle, and showed her how to load, aim, and fire. Her hands trembled at first, but her determination outweighed her fear. By the end of the week, she could hit a target from 50 yards with a steady shot. Their lives fell into rhythm. Mornings began with the rising sun and the sound of roosters. Afternoons were filled with labor that left them bone-tired. Evenings carried the glow of lantern light and conversations that grew longer with each passing day. She told him of her people, of stories passed from her grandmother, of nights when the stars were read like books and rivers sang of old spirits. He listened, sometimes closing his eyes, imagining a world far removed from the bitterness of men. But as their bond grew stronger, the town's resentment sharpened. One day, when John rode into town for feed, he found a note nailed to the door of the general store. The handwriting was crude, but the message was clear. "Send the girl away or face the consequences." He crumpled the paper in his hand, his jaw tightening. Trouble wasn't just brewing, it was at his doorstep. That evening he told Anna what he had found. She looked down at her calloused hands and whispered, "I should go. If I leave, they won't hurt you." John's voice turned firm, almost angry. "Don't say that. You're not running again. Not while I've got something to say about it." His words carried more than defiance. They carried a truth he had been fighting to admit. She wasn't just a burden he had taken on out of pity. She was part of his life now, part of his home, and the thought of her leaving twisted something deep inside him. A week later, the storm finally broke. It was a night heavy with clouds, the kind that smothered the moon and made the air thick. The sound of hooves echoed again, louder this time, more numerous. John stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, as a group of men rode up with torches. At their head was Samuel Carter, a rancher whose brother had been killed years earlier in a skirmish with Apache. Hatred had hollowed him out, and now it burned in his eyes as he shouted, "Miller! We warned you! That girl is a curse. Send her out or we'll burn this place to the ground." John stood tall, the rifle steady in his hands. "This is my land, my home. She stays." The men shifted, restless, their anger colliding with fear. For a moment, it seemed bloodshed was inevitable. But before anyone moved, Anna stepped forward, her face illuminated by the torchlight. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the wind. "I am not your enemy. I came here with nothing, not to bring war, but to find life again. If you burn this place, you burn your own honor." Her words startled them. Few had ever heard an Apache girl speak with such strength in English, and fewer still expected her to confront them head-on. Samuel sneered, unwilling to be swayed. "Pretty words won't change blood, girl." He raised his pistol, aiming toward her. In that instant, John's rifle snapped upward, and his voice cut like steel. "You'll lower that gun, Carter, or you won't live to regret it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Torches flickered, horses shifted nervously, and finally, after a long standoff, Samuel spat on the ground and motioned for the others to leave. "This isn't over," he muttered, before riding off into the night. John lowered his rifle slowly, his heart still pounding. Anna exhaled, realizing how close death had brushed against them. That night neither slept. They sat by the fire, the crackle of flames the only sound between them for a long time. Finally, Anna whispered, "You risk your life for me again and again. Why?" John stared into the flames, struggling with words he had buried for years. "Because you're not just someone I took in. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to keep fighting." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since he had found her, she reached for his hand. In that moment, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of unspoken promises. The weeks that followed were uneasy. The threat lingered, but the men did not return immediately. John continued his work with watchful eyes, while Anna proved herself more each day. Together, they built something fragile yet strong, a partnership forged not just by survival, but by trust. Neighbors who once judged began to notice the change in John. His ranch flourished, his cattle grew strong, and word spread that perhaps the Apache girl was not a curse, but a blessing. One day, while riding out to check the cattle, John looked across the open land and realized it no longer felt like endless emptiness. With Anna by his side, the land was alive, filled with purpose. She had come into his life as a desperate plea, but now she was the heart of his ranch, the reason he woke each morning, ready to face whatever storms might come. And though the world around them remained harsh, filled with prejudice and danger, they had carved out a truth that no torch, no hatred, no whispered threats could take away. For in the heart of the Wild West, where survival often meant standing alone, they had found something far greater, the strength to stand together. The story of John Miller and Anna, the Apache girl who once cried that she couldn't live without a man, had become something larger than either of them expected. It was no longer just about survival. It was about defiance, about love found in the unlikeliest of places, and about the unshakable will to claim a life in a land that gave nothing freely. And though danger still loomed on the horizon, they knew one thing with certainty: together they would face it all.